Cale Mercer wiped the grease from his hands and stared out the viewport at the pale orange curve of Titan below him, wondering why two armed soldiers from the Galactic Concord were standing in his workshop, asking him to come with them. He was nobody special, and he knew it. He was 34 years old, a human engineer working at a shipyard that was falling apart almost as fast as the ships he repaired there. He had not slept in 2 days because a refugee barge carrying 900 people had limped into dock with a cracked reactor housing and a life support system held together with cable ties and hope. He had fixed it because that was what he did. And now 2 soldiers in gleaming armor were telling him that the archivists of the Galactic Concord had summoned him to the Nexion Ring, the capital station at the center of civilized space, and that he needed to come immediately. Cale asked if he was in trouble. The soldiers did not answer. Journey took 3 days aboard a Concord cruiser that was nicer than any place Cale had ever lived. And during those 3 days, nobody told him anything useful. So he spent the time worrying and looking out windows at stars he had only ever seen on old navigation charts. When they arrived at the Nexion Ring, he understood for the first time how small his life had been. The station was a ring of metal and light wrapped around a dwarf star, home to billions of beings from hundreds of species, and it hummed with a kind of energy that made the air taste like static, and Cale felt like a mouse that had wandered into a cathedral. They brought him to a chamber deep inside the station where the archivists waited. The archivists were not any single species, but a council of the oldest and most learned scholars in the galaxy, beings who had dedicated their lives to preserving the knowledge and legal records of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before humanity had. Learned to make fire, and they sat behind a curved table of black stone and looked down at Cale with expressions he could not read. One of them spoke, a tall creature with silver skin and 6 eyes that blinked in sequence, and it said that Cale Mercer had been selected. Selected for what? Cale asked. The archivist told him about the throne of Aethon. 12,000 years ago, a civilization called the Vorai Dominion had ruled a quarter of the galaxy, and they had been the most advanced species to ever exist, masters of technology so far beyond anything alive today that their simplest tools were still mysteries to the greatest minds of the modern age. And before they vanished, they had built one final creation, a ship. Not just any ship, but the greatest vessel ever constructed, a warship and a tool and a monument all in one, 40 kilometers long and built from materials that modern science could not even name, and they had left it in orbit around a dying star with a single instruction encoded in their final testament. The ship would choose its own master. For 12,000 years, every powerful species in the galaxy had sent their champions to try to board the throne of Aethon. And for 12,000 years, the ship had refused them all. And the airlock had stayed sealed, and the lights had stayed dark, and the greatest treasure in the cosmos had sat silent and waiting. Until now. The archivists explained that the Vorai had left a phrase carved into the hull in a language so old that it had taken centuries to translate. And the phrase said this: "The throne shall open for the one who builds not for glory, but for need." A deep scan of galactic records, billions of lives analyzed by ancient algorithms the Vorai themselves had designed, had produced a single match: Cale Mercer. A human engineer who had spent his career not building warships or monuments, but fixing broken water recyclers on refugee barges, and patching cracked hulls on colony transports, and keeping people alive with nothing but skill and stubbornness, and a refusal to quit when the parts ran out. The chamber erupted. Ambassadors from a dozen species who had been watching from the gallery began shouting. And Cale could feel the anger in the room like heat from a furnace. And the loudest voice belonged to a massive creature covered in bone-white armor plates who stepped forward and slammed a fist against the stone railing, hard enough to crack it. This was a Tethari, Kale realized, one of the oldest warrior races in the galaxy, beings who had been fighting and conquering since before humans had discovered iron. And the Tethari ambassador declared that this was an insult beyond measure, that the throne of Aethon was meant for a warrior and not for some fragile, short-lived human who smelled like engine grease. Beside the Tethari, a slender figure with pale blue skin and eyes like frozen mercury spoke in. A voice as calm and cold as deep space. And this was a Celavan, a member of the technocrat species that believed the galaxy should be governed by pure logic and efficiency. And the Celavan counselor said that regardless of what the old algorithms claimed, allowing a human access to the most powerful technology in existence was statistically reckless, and that the Concord should intervene. Kale stood in the middle of all of it, and felt his heart pounding and his mouth going dry, and a voice in the back of his head screaming at him that there had been a mistake, that he was just a mechanic from Titan, that he had no business being here. But the archivist silenced the chamber and said that the Vorai's testament was law, older than any government currently in existence, and that the selection would proceed. They took him to the Dead Star. The ship that carried him was fast and quiet, and the crew avoided looking at him as if he were already something other than human. And when they dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at the edge of the system, Kale pressed his face to the viewport and saw it. The throne of Aethon. It hung in the darkness like a piece of the void had been carved into shape. 40 kilometers of black hull, covered in geometric patterns that shifted and moved like living things, catching the faint red light of the dying star and turning it into something that looked almost like breathing. And it was so large that Kale's mind refused to process it as a single object and kept trying to turn it into a landscape instead. He had built ships his whole life and repaired more than he could count, and he had never seen anything that made him feel the way this made him feel, which was very small and very afraid, and also something else that he did not have a word for, something like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing that the next step would change everything. They brought him to the airlock in a shuttle, and he walked across the boarding bridge alone, because the ship had never allowed anyone else inside, and there was no reason to think it would start now. Kale put his hand on the door. It opened. Light flooded outward, warm and golden, and air that smelled like rain and metal and something ancient washed over him. And he stepped inside and felt the floor hum beneath his boots as if the ship recognized him, the way a dog recognizes its owner after a long time apart. He walked forward, and the lights came alive ahead of him, racing down corridors that stretched so far he could not see the end, and the walls pulsed with patterns that moved in time with his heartbeat. And then a sound filled the ship, deep and harmonic, and so vast that he felt it in his bones rather than heard it with his ears. Then a voice spoke directly into his mind, not through speakers, but inside his thoughts, as if someone had placed words into his brain, the way you would place a letter into a mailbox. And the voice was old and calm and enormous, and it said, "You are incomplete. I will fix that." Kale Mercer collapsed to the floor of the greatest ship in the galaxy, and the door sealed shut behind him, and the lights burned bright, and the throne of Aethon woke up for the first time in 12,000 years. Kale woke up in a room made of light. He was lying on a surface that was neither hard nor soft, but something in between. Something that adjusted to his body the way water adjusts to the shape of a hand dipped into it. And the walls around him were not really walls at all, but shifting planes of pale gold illumination that moved like curtains in a wind he could not feel. He sat up, and his head hurt, and his skin tingled as if he had been standing too close to a lightning strike. And he looked down at his hands and saw that they were the same hands they had always been, calloused and scarred and stained with years of work, But something was different. He could feel the ship, not like a vibration under his feet or a sound in his ears, but like a presence in his mind, vast and patient, and impossibly detailed, as if someone had taken the blueprint of the most complex machine ever built and pressed it directly into his consciousness. And he could sense every corridor and every chamber and every system in all 40 kilometers of the throne of Aethon. The way he could sense the position of his own fingers without looking at them. The voice spoke again, the same voice from before, and this time it did not hurt. "Welcome, Cale Mercer," it said, "and I am called Aethon, and I am the mind of this vessel, and you have been asleep for 9 days." 9 days, Cale repeated out loud, and his voice sounded strange in the golden room, too small for the space it occupied. "During those 9 days I have been repairing you," Aethon said. Cale felt a spike of fear and asked what that meant and what had been done to him. Aethon explained, and the explanation changed everything Cale thought he knew about himself and about humanity. The Vorai had spent thousands of years studying every intelligent species in the galaxy. Not just their technology and their cultures, but their biology, down to the deepest level of their genetic code. They had discovered about humans had surprised them more than anything else they had ever found. Humans were unfinished, not broken, not flawed, but incomplete, like a building with the foundation and frame constructed, but the upper floors still missing. And the Vorai had determined that of all the species they had studied, humans possessed the highest latent potential for adaptation and growth, potential that evolution had not yet had time to unlock, because humanity was so young compared to the ancient races of the galaxy. The throne had not made Cale into something alien. It had made him into what humans could become given another 1,000,000 years of evolution, and it had done it in 9 days. His senses were sharper now, not in the superhuman way of stories where a man can suddenly hear a whisper from a kilometer away, but in a deeper way, a way that let him perceive patterns and connections and systems that had always been invisible to him. At a wall of the ship, he did not just see metal and light, but understood the engineering behind it, the way a musician understands a song, not through analysis, but through something closer to feeling. His mind was faster but not colder, and that was the part that surprised him the most, because he had expected the transformation to make him think like a machine, logical and precise and empty. But instead, it had done the opposite. It had made his emotions richer and more textured, as if he had been seeing the world in black and white his whole life, and someone had suddenly turned on the color. Aethon told him that this was the thing the Vorai had admired most about humans, the thing that had made them choose humanity above all other species. And it was not intelligence, or strength, or even adaptability, but the fact that humans felt things so deeply and so stubbornly that no amount of power could burn the feeling out of them. The ancient races of the galaxy had evolved past their emotions over millions of years, trading warmth for efficiency and passion for precision. And the Vorai had watched it happen again and again, and had come to believe that this was the great trap of advancement, that every species eventually became so powerful that it forgot why power mattered in the first place. Humans had not yet fallen into that trap, and the Vorai had bet everything on the hope that they never would. Cale sat with this knowledge for a long time in the golden room, and tried to understand what it meant, and how he was supposed to carry it. And then he asked Aethon to show him the ship. What followed was the most overwhelming experience of his life. Aethon guided him through corridors that seemed to go on forever, past chambers the size of cities, and showed him things that made his newly expanded mind struggle to keep up. The weapon systems could crack the shields of any known fleet with a single focus burst, fold space in ways that made faster-than-light travel look like crawling. And the fabrication bays contained templates and raw materials sufficient to construct entire fleets of warships, or, if the user preferred, entire cities. And then There was the Genesis engine. It sat in the deepest part of the ship, a sphere of contained energy half a kilometer across, humming with a sound that was almost like music. And Athon explained that it was a terraforming device of impossible power, capable of transforming a dead rock into a living world with breathable air, drinkable water, and fertile soil in a matter of days. Cale stared at it and felt something tighten in his chest, because he understood what this meant. Not just the power of it, but the responsibility. And he said out loud that he was an engineer, and not a god, and not a general, and not a king. And he asked why the Vorai had not given this ship to someone who actually wanted to rule. Athon was quiet for a moment, and then said something that Cale would remember for the rest of his life. Conquerors build thrones, Athon said, and engineers build homes. And that is why the ship is called what it is. Not for the one who sits upon it, but for the one who builds it into something worth sitting upon. Cale leaned against the railing overlooking the Genesis engine, and closed his eyes and breathed, and the ship breathed with him, and for a moment everything was still. Then Athon spoke again, and this time the calm was gone from its voice. "I must inform you that we are being watched," Athon said, "and long-range sensors have detected communications traffic across 17 species regarding the activation of this vessel, and the tone of those communications is not friendly." Cale opened his eyes. The galaxy knew. The greatest ship ever built was awake, and a human was at the controls. And every government, and every warlord, and every power-hungry faction in civilized space was now asking the same question, which was how they could take it from him. Athon displayed the sensor readings, and Cale saw fleets mobilizing across multiple sectors, and diplomatic channels burning with furious transmissions, and covert operations being planned in encrypted frequencies that the throne cracked as easily as a child opens a candy wrapper. The Tethari High Command had already dispatched a war fleet, 600 ships under the command of a warlord named Ryvon, the same species whose ambassador had cracked the stone railing in the archivist's chamber, and they were coming to take the throne by force. The Celavon had taken a different approach, quieter and more dangerous, and their intelligence operatives were already running simulations on how to either assassinate Cale or infiltrate the ship's systems through technological means. And from beyond the edge of charted space, so far away that even the throne sensors could barely detect it, something else was moving, something enormous and dark and hungry. And Athon's voice dropped to something that sounded almost like fear when it said that this was the real reason the throne had been built. Not for the petty wars of living species, but for the thing that was coming from the void, the thing that had destroyed the Vorai 12,000 years ago. Cale gripped the railing and looked out at the Genesis engine and felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, the ship and the power and the enemies and the ancient darkness approaching from the edge of forever. He was an engineer from Titan who fixed broken things for a living, and now the whole galaxy was broken and looking at him to fix it. The Tethari warfleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, like a fist punching through a curtain. 600 warships, arranged in a battle formation that had been used to conquer star systems for longer than humanity had existed. And at the center of the formation sat the flagship of Warlord Ryvon, a brutal mountain of metal and guns called the Fang of Ages. Cale stood on the command deck of the throne of Athon and watched them arrive on a display that wrapped around him in every direction, showing him the stars and the ships, and the faint red glow of the dying star nearby, and he felt his stomach drop the way it always did when something was about to go very wrong. 600 ships, Athon said calmly, and combined firepower sufficient to glass a continent in approximately 4 minutes, and Warlord Ryvon is hailing us. Put him through, Cale said. The face of the Tethari warlord appeared before him, projected into the air at 3 times life size. It was a face built for war, heavy brow ridges, and a jaw like the prow of a battering ram, and eyes the color of boiling copper. And when Ryvon spoke, His voice was deep enough to make the air vibrate. "Human," Ryvan said, and he said the word the way someone might say insect. "You are sitting in something that does not belong to you, and I am giving you 1 hour to step outside and surrender the vessel to the Tethari Dominion. And if you do not, then I will open fire and peel that ship apart layer by layer until I find your body." Kale took a breath and tried to keep his voice steady. He said that he did not want to fight, and that the ship had chosen him according to the rules set down by the Vorai themselves, and that he was willing to talk about this and find a solution that worked for everyone. Ryvan laughed, and it was not a kind laugh. "The hour begins now," Ryvan said, and the transmission cut off. Kale turned to Athan and asked how bad this was going. 2B. Athan paused for a moment, as if considering whether honesty was the kindest approach, and then said that the combined firepower of 600 Tethari warships represented approximately 0.003% of the energy required to damage the hull of the throne of Athon. Kale blinked. He asked Athon to repeat that. Athon repeated it, and added that the throne could withstand the simultaneous detonation of approximately 11 stars before structural integrity became a concern, and that the Tethari fleet was, in the most respectful terms Athon could find, not a threat. Kale sat down in the command chair and stared at the display for a long time, and thought about what kind of person he wanted to be, because this was a moment that would define everything that came after, and he knew it. The hour passed. Ryvan opened fire. 600 ships unleashed everything they had, beams of coherent energy and volleys of antimatter. Torpedoes and kinetic rounds the size of buildings, and the space around the throne turned white with the fury of it. And the noise of the impacts should have been deafening, except that there was no noise, because the shields absorbed everything so completely that Kale did not even feel a vibration through the deck. On the display he watched the energy readings of the attack register as a thin line, barely visible at the bottom of the scale, like trying to measure a raindrop in an ocean. Kale gave the order. The throne of Athon responded with a single pulse of energy that expanded outward in a sphere of blue-white light, and it passed through all 600 ships simultaneously. And when it was gone, every weapon system and every engine in the Tethari fleet was dead, shut down with surgical precision at the component level, and not a single crew member on any ship was harmed. 600 warships drifted in silence, dark and powerless, and Kale opened a channel to Ryvan and said 7 words. "I am an engineer, and I fix things and I do not break them, and do not make me change my mind." The channel was silent for a long time. The galaxy watched, because of course the galaxy watched, because every intelligence agency, and every news network, and every government had sensors pointed at this confrontation. And what they saw was a single human in a single ship disable the most feared war fleet in the galaxy without killing anyone. And the silence that followed was louder than the battle had been. Words spread at the speed of light and then faster, carried on encrypted channels and open broadcasts and whispered conversations in the halls of power across 1,000 worlds. And the story changed, and the question was no longer, who is this human, but what is this human going to do? The Celavan moved next. They sent a diplomat, Counselor Vaeth, a slender and elegant creature who arrived on a ship that was all smooth curves and polished surfaces, and who spoke with a voice like silk being drawn across glass. And Vaeth sat across from Kale in a meeting chamber aboard the throne, and offered a partnership. The Celavan would provide political protection, shielding Kale from the anger of the other species, and in exchange, Kale would share access to the throne's technology, so that the Celavan could study it and use it for the betterment of all civilization. And Vaeth smiled as she said this, and it was a very convincing smile. Kale almost agreed because he was tired and scared, and the idea of having allies sounded wonderful. Then Athon spoke privately into his mind, and told him that 17 minutes before Veyth's ship had docked, the Celavan had deployed quantum parasites onto the throne's hull, microscopic devices designed to burrow into the ship's systems and create backdoor access. And the throne had detected and destroyed them effortlessly. But the fact remained that the Celavan had tried to hack the most powerful ship in the galaxy while pretending to offer friendship. Kale looked at Veyth, and something in his expression must have changed, because the smile on the Celavan's face flickered for just a moment. He told Veyth that he knew about the parasites, and Veyth's face went completely blank, which for a Celavan was the equivalent of screaming. And Kale said that the offer was declined, and that the next time the Celavan wanted to talk, they should try doing it without stabbing him in the back at the same time. Veyth left without another word. Kale sat alone in the chamber after she was gone, and put his head in his hands, and thought about the fact that every powerful species in the galaxy either wanted to destroy him or manipulate him, and that sitting inside this ship and waiting for the next attack was not a plan. It was a countdown. He needed to do something so big and so good that the galaxy could not justify taking the conscience throne away from him, something that would make people see him not as a threat, but as something worth protecting. He told Ethan to search for the people in the galaxy who needed help the most. The answer came quickly. Hesperax 4 was a colony world on the Outer Rim where a terraforming project had failed catastrophically 3 years ago. And the atmosphere was collapsing, and 2 million people of 6 different species were slowly suffocating as the air grew thinner every day, and every government in the Concord had looked at the cost of saving them and decided it was too high, and moved on. Kale took the throne to Hesperax 4. When he arrived, the colony sent a desperate transmission asking if he was there to evacuate them. And Kale said no, and he activated the Genesis engine. For 72 hours, the throne of Ethan hung in orbit above the dying world, and poured energy and matter and something that was almost like intention into the planet below. The brown and gray surface turned green, and the thin, poisoned atmosphere thickened and cleared, and rivers appeared where there had been dust. And the colonists came out of their sealed habitats and stood in open air for the first time in 3 years and breathed. 2 million people looked up at the sky and cried. The galaxy watched that too, and the story changed again. Not a human stole the greatest ship, but a human used it to save people that nobody else would save. And for the first time, since this had all begun, Kale felt something that was not fear or exhaustion, but something warm and stubborn and human. Something that felt like maybe this was what he was supposed to be doing all along. Then Aethon interrupted him. The ship's deep space sensors, which could see further than anything else in the galaxy, had detected something at the very edge of perception, far beyond the galactic rim, and it was moving inward. It was vast, and it was dark. Consumed everything in its path, stars and planets and the empty space between them, leaving nothing behind. And the sensors showed a trail of absolute nothingness, stretching back across distances that made the galaxy itself look small. Aethon called it the Void Tide, and then Aethon said, quietly and with something that sounded very much like fear for a being that was not supposed to feel anything at all, that this was the reason the throne of Aethon had been built 12,000 years ago. This was the enemy that had destroyed the Vorai, and it was coming back, and it would reach the outer colonies in 6 months, and the galactic core in 2 years, and after that there would be nothing left. Kale stared at the display, showing the advancing darkness, and felt the warmth drain out of him, and something cold take its place. The Vorai, the most advanced civilization in history, had built the greatest ship in the galaxy to fight this thing. Kale brought the data to the Galactic Concord, and stood before the assembled representatives of every spacefaring species and civilization, and told them that they were all going to die. He did not say it like that, of course, because he was not trying to start a panic, But the information spoke for itself, and when the throne's sensor logs played across the great display in the Concorde chamber, showing the void tide consuming star systems like a mouth swallowing light, the room went very quiet, in a way that rooms only go quiet when everyone in them is afraid at the same time. The data was clear, and Athon had verified it against every known record of the Vorai's final days, and the conclusion was simple and terrible. The void tide was a wave of entropic annihilation that consumed matter and energy and space itself, and it moved faster than light, and it was heading for the heart of the galaxy, and no weapon ever built by any living species could stop it. Silence lasted 11 seconds, and then the room exploded. The Tethari delegation demanded that Kale surrender the throne immediately, so that real warriors could take the fight to this enemy, instead of leaving the fate of the galaxy in the hands of a creature whose species still thought fire was impressive. The Celavan proposed a strategic withdrawal, which was a polite way of saying they wanted to sacrifice the Outer Rim colonies and use the time to fortify the core worlds. And when someone pointed out that this would mean abandoning 4 billion people, the Celavan counselor said that survival required difficult mathematics. A coalition of smaller species accused Kale of fabricating the entire threat to consolidate power, because if you controlled the greatest ship in the galaxy and also controlled the only information about an invisible enemy, then you controlled everything. And several delegates began shouting that this was exactly the kind of trick a human would pull. The chamber dissolved into chaos, and Kale stood at the center of it and felt the noise wash over him like a wave. And for a moment, he wanted nothing more than to walk out of the room and get back on the throne and fly away and let them all figure it out for themselves. But he did not do that. Instead, he did something that no leader in the history of the Galactic Concorde had ever done before. Something so unexpected that it cut through the shouting like a blade through paper. He told them he was scared. Not in a dramatic way, and not as a performance, but in the plain and simple way that a person admits something true when they are too tired to pretend otherwise. And he stood there in front of the most powerful beings in the galaxy and said that he was a mechanic from a shipyard above Titan, and that 6 weeks ago the most complicated thing in his life had been a cracked reactor housing, and that now he was standing in a room full of people who had been running civilizations for longer than his species had been alive, and telling them about something that could end everything. He said that the throne of Athon was powerful beyond anything he had imagined, but that it was not enough, because the Vorai had commanded the throne at the height of their power, with thousands of years of preparation, and they had still lost. And if the greatest civilization in history could not beat this thing alone, then he certainly could not. He said that the only chance any of them had was to work together, all of them, every species and every fleet and every mind, because the void tide did not care about borders or politics or whether you were ancient or young or proud or humble. It would eat them all exactly the same. He said all of this in simple words, without eloquence or grandeur, and his voice cracked once near the end, and he did not try to hide it. The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence this time. The Tethari warlord Ryvon, who had traveled to the Concorde after his fleet had been repaired and returned to him by Kale's order, because Kale had not only disabled his ships, but had then sent engineering drones to fix them, stood up from the gallery. Ryvon was enormous even by Tethari standards, a wall of bone plate and muscle and scars from battles fought across 100 worlds, and he looked down at Kale with an expression that was impossible to read. And then he spoke. "You shamed me without killing me," Ryvon said, "and in 10,000 years of war, no enemy has ever done that. And I have spent every day since trying to decide if you are a fool or something else entirely, and I still do not know. But I know this, that a fool does not admit fear and then choose to stand anyway. And whatever you are, I will stand with you, and the Tethari will fight." The room shifted. One by one, other delegations began to speak. Not all of them, and not immediately. Because trust is not built in a single moment, but enough of them. And the tide turned not because Kale had shown strength, but because he had shown something that the ancient races had forgotten was possible, which was the ability to be powerful and afraid at the same time, and to keep going anyway. Kale threw himself into the work with the kind of desperate energy that he had always brought to impossible repair jobs, the kind where the ship is venting atmosphere, and the crew is counting down the minutes, and you do not have the right parts, so you make them out of whatever you have. He opened the throne's databases to every species that would participate, sharing Vorai technology and schematics and fabrication templates without restriction. And the Saluvan were so stunned by this that Counselor Viaith herself came to him and asked why he would give away the single greatest strategic advantage in the galaxy. Kale looked at her and said, "What good is the best ship in the galaxy if there is no galaxy left?" Viaith stared at him for a long time, and then nodded once, and committed the Saluvan's full scientific resources to the effort. And if her reasons were practical rather than noble, Kale did not care, because he needed every mind he could get. He designed a defense network, not a single superweapon, because he had learned from the Vorai's failure that concentrated power was not the answer, but a distributed system that used the unique strengths of every participating species, Tethari aggression and combat experience forming the front line, Saluvan precision and analytical capability managing targeting and coordination, human adaptability and creative problem-solving filling the gaps that rigid doctrine could not cover, and dozens of other species contributing things that no one else could provide. The work consumed him. He slept 4 hours a night on a cot in the throne's engineering bay, and ate meals standing up, reviewing schematics, and spent his waking hours in meetings and design sessions and arguments with engineers and admirals and scientists from species whose biology he could barely pronounce. And through all of it, the throne of Aethon hummed around him like a living thing, responding to his commands and amplifying his designs, and turning his rough sketches into working technology at a speed that left the alien engineers speechless. Weeks passed, and the defense network took shape. Stations and satellites and weapons platforms spreading across the projected path of the void tide like a net being cast across the stars. And for the first time there was something that felt almost like hope. Then the hope shattered. Aethon woke Kale from one of his rare hours of sleep with a single sentence. The void tide has accelerated. The latest sensor data showed that the wave of annihilation had increased its speed by a factor of 12, and the revised timeline gave them not 6 months, but 6 days, and the outer colony of Meridian's Reach, with its 40 million inhabitants, was directly in the path, and there was no time to evacuate. The defense network was not ready, only 40% complete, and the pieces that were finished were scattered across too wide an area to concentrate at Meridian's Reach in time. Kale stood on the command deck and looked at the display showing the void tide rushing inward like a black wave across the stars, and the small bright dot of Meridian's Reach sitting in its path. And he made a decision in less than 3 seconds, because some decisions do not require thought. They require only the knowledge of who you are. Process could strip away the very qualities that had made him worthy of the throne in the first place. Kale asked what qualities Aethon meant. "Your humanity," Aethon said. Kale was quiet for a moment, and then he said that 40 million people were going to die if he did not go, and that his humanity was not worth more than their lives. The throne of Aethon turned toward the darkness and accelerated, and the stars blurred and vanished, and Kale Mercer went to fight the thing that had killed gods. The throne of Aethon arrived at Meridian's Reach 3 hours before the void tide, and Kale used every second of that time to begin the evacuation, launching every transport and shuttle the colony had, while the throne's fabrication bays produced additional evacuation craft at a speed that should have been impossible. and the colonists ran and flew and scrambled for the ships, while the sky above them slowly turned black at the edges, as the nothingness crept closer. It was not going to be enough time. Kale knew it, and Athon knew it, and the 40 million people on the surface knew it. And when the last evacuation window closed, there were still 12 million people on the ground with nowhere to go. Kale turned the throne to face the void tide. He had never seen it with his own eyes before, only on sensor displays and data readouts, and the reality of it was so much worse than the data had suggested, because the void tide was not darkness the way space is dark, was the absence of everything, a wall of nothing that stretched from horizon to horizon and swallowed the stars as it advanced. And looking at it was like looking at a wound in the universe, a place where existence itself had been torn away and replaced with something that was not even emptiness, because emptiness implies a space waiting to be filled. And this was the end of the concept of space altogether. Athon, Kale said, and his voice was steady in a way that surprised him. Let us begin. The throne of Athon unleashed its full power for the first time in 12,000 years. The ship had been holding back during every previous engagement, the way a grown man holds back when arm wrestling a child. And now the restraints came off, and what emerged was something that made the disabling of the Tethari fleet look like a candle compared to a sun. Beams of energy that operated on principles no living scientist could name lanced out from the throne and struck them, leading edge of the void tide, and where they hit the nothingness recoiled, actually pulled back, and for the first time in its existence, the thing that had consumed the Vorai and devoured star systems and swallowed light itself was forced to stop. The void tide pushed back. It surged forward with a kind of mindless hunger that was not intelligent, but was relentless in the way that gravity is relentless. And the throne fired again and again, and the space between ship and annihilation became a storm of energy so intense that it bent the light from distant stars and made the fabric of reality ripple like the surface of water struck by a stone. Kale sank deeper into the ship. The connection between his mind and the throne had always been like holding a tool in his hand, familiar and controlled. But now it was like becoming the tool, like dissolving into the machine and feeling every system and every weapon and every pulse of energy as if they were his own heartbeat. And it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. And it was taking pieces of him. He felt the memory of his mother's kitchen fade first, the smell of bread and the warmth of the oven and the sound of her humming while she worked. And it did not vanish all at once, but grew thin and pale, like a photograph left in the sun. And then the taste of bad coffee from the machine in the Titan shipyard went next. And then the feeling of engine grease between his fingers. And one by one, the small human things that made Kale Mercer who he was began to dissolve into the vast awareness of the ship. He fought for 11 hours. 11 hours of holding the line while the evacuation continued behind him. 11 hours of pouring everything the throne had into the face of oblivion. And it was working. The void tide was not advancing, but it was not retreating either. And Kale was running out of himself, becoming something enormous and cold and brilliant that could calculate the energy output of a star, but could no longer remember what rain sounded like. Then the void tide adapted. It shifted and changed and found a frequency that slipped past the throne's weapons, the way water finds cracks in a wall, and it surged forward. And the ship shuddered for the first time, and alarms that had never sounded in 12,000 years filled the command deck with a wailing that cut through even the vastness of Kale's expanded consciousness. He was losing. Athon's voice reached him from very far away, thin and urgent, and it said that weapons alone could not stop the void tide, that the Vorai had tried this approach and failed, and that force was not the answer. Kale heard the words, but they were distant and abstract, because he was so deep in the ship now that human language felt like trying to listen to someone whispering from the bottom of a well. And for a terrible moment, he could not remember why any of this mattered. He was, or what he was fighting for, and the cold, vast intelligence that the throne had made him into, looked at the problem and saw only equations and energy and the mathematics of inevitable defeat. And then, from somewhere so deep inside him that the transformation had not yet reached it, a memory surfaced. It was small and ordinary and had no business surviving when everything else was fading, but it held on with the stubbornness that only truly unimportant memories possess, the kind of memory that hides in the corners of your mind and refuses to leave because it has nowhere else to go. He was on a refugee barge above Titan at 3 a.m, and he was lying on his back under a water recycler with his arms aching and his eyes burning from lack of sleep. And a little Tethari girl was sitting on the floor next to him, watching him work with the wide, curious eyes that children have when they are seeing someone do something they do not understand. And she asked him why he was helping them when they were not his species. And Kale, exhausted and covered in coolant and barely able to keep his eyes open, had said because the pipe does not care who drinks from it. The memory burned through the cold like a match struck in a dark room. It was so small and so human and so stubbornly ordinary that it cut through 12,000 years of Vorai engineering and the vast cosmic awareness of the greatest ship ever built. And Cale Mercer came back to himself, gasping and shaking, and suddenly, painfully, wonderfully human again. And in that moment of clarity, he saw the Void Tide not as an enemy, but as a system, not as a living thing with intent, but as a process, a broken process, and his engineer's mind, the mind that had been fixing broken things since he was old enough to hold a wrench, looked at the Void Tide the way it had looked at 1,000 malfunctioning machines before it. He saw the pattern. The Void Tide was not a weapon, and it was not alive, and it was not evil. It was an entropic feedback loop, a cascading failure in the structure of space-time itself. And the Vorai had accidentally triggered it 12,000 years ago, when their technology had grown so powerful that it cracked the foundations of reality without them even noticing. And the crack had spread and grown and fed on itself until it became the monster that ate their empire. It was not an enemy. It was a broken machine. And Cale Mercer fixed broken machines. He pulled himself out of the weapon systems and reached instead for the Genesis engine, the great sphere of creation energy in the heart of the ship, the tool designed not to destroy but to build, to take dead worlds and make them alive. And he began to reconfigure it with hands that shook and a mind that blazed, and the desperate focused intensity of a man who has exactly one chance to get this right. He did not try to destroy the Void Tide. He inverted the Genesis engine's output and aimed it not at the annihilation, but at the cracks in space-time beneath it, the original damage that was feeding the cascade. And he poured the energy of creation itself into the wounds in reality, the way he had once poured sealant into cracked hull plates, not with precision or elegance, but with the brute, stubborn determination of someone who refuses to let a broken thing stay broken. The process nearly killed him. The throne was not designed for this, not exactly, and the energy required was beyond anything even Ethan had calculated. And Cale felt himself being pulled apart again, felt the transformation surging forward, trying to erase him, to make room for the power flowing through him. And the memory of the little girl and the water recycler began to fade again. He held on. He held on with everything he had, not with the vast power of the throne or the expanded awareness of his transformed mind, but with the small, stubborn human refusal to let go of the things that mattered. And he thought about bad coffee and engine grease, and the way Titan looked at sunrise, and the sound of his own name spoken by people who knew him. And he held on. The Genesis engine fired. The beam struck the leading edge of the Void Tide and passed through it, and reached the damaged space-time beneath. And where it touched, the cracks began to seal, and the entropic cascade began to slow, and the void tide did not explode or shatter or die, because it had never been alive. It simply began to unravel, dissolving into harmless background radiation as the damage that had sustained it was repaired. It spread outward from the point of contact, like ripples moving in reverse, the nothingness filling back in with somethingness, stars reappearing where they had been swallowed, space reasserting itself where it had been erased, and across the galaxy, the advancing edge of the void tide stuttered and slowed and stopped, and then began to retreat, pulling back like a tide going out, which is why the name had been so accurate all along. Cale Mercer collapsed on the deck of the command bridge, and the throne of Athon went quiet around him, its vast systems powering down to a hum, and the lights dimmed to something soft and warm, and Athon said nothing for a long time, because some moments are too large for words, even when you are an intelligence that has existed for 12 millennia. When Cale woke up, he was lying on the same surface where he had first regained consciousness after the transformation, and the golden light was gentle, and he felt diminished in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, like a balloon slowly returning to its natural size after being inflated too far. The transformation had partially receded. He was still connected to the ship, and still enhanced beyond what any normal human could be, but the vast, cold cosmic awareness had pulled back, and in its place was something warmer, and messier, and more familiar. And when he sat up and looked at his hands, they were shaking, and he could smell engine grease, even though there was none on him, which meant his brain was remembering how to be human again, filling in the gaps with sense memories, like a house settling back onto its foundations. The void tide was gone. Athon confirmed it. The entropic cascade had been neutralized across the entire affected region, and the damage to space-time was healing itself now that the feedback loop had been broken, and the galaxy was safe, and 12,000 years of accumulated existential dread had been resolved by a mechanic from Titan, who had treated the apocalypse like a busted water pipe. The aftermath was loud and complicated and political in the way that aftermaths always are, but none of it touched Cale, because he spent most of it sleeping and eating and sitting in the quiet places of the throne and remembering how to be a person again. Warlord Ryvan came to see him. The Tethari warlord stood in the doorway of Cale's quarters and looked at him with an expression that contained something Cale had never seen on a Tethari face before. Something that might have been wonder, or might have been confusion, or might have been both. "You could have ruled," Ryvan said, "and you had the power to make every species in the galaxy kneel, and the ship could have made you immortal, and instead you almost died fixing a crack in the floor of the universe, and I need you to explain to me why." Cale thought about it and said that he did not know how to rule and did not want to learn, and that the crack needed fixing, and he was the one with the tools. Ryvan stared at him for a long time. "What will you do now?" Ryvan asked. Cale said that there was a settlement on Drava 6 with a failing atmospheric processor, and that he thought he would go take a look. Ryvan stared at him for even longer. Tethari Dominion, commander of 600 warships, and veteran of 100 campaigns, and heir to 10,000 years of unbroken warrior tradition, laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and surprised, and shaking his whole massive frame, and it echoed off the walls of the throne of Athon, and it was the first time in recorded history that a Tethari warlord had laughed, not in triumph or contempt, but in pure, genuine delight at the absurdity of a man who had saved the galaxy and wanted to go fix a pipe. Ryvan left still laughing, and Cale smiled and finished his coffee, which was bad because he had made it himself, and he had never been good at making coffee, but it was warm and real, and it tasted like being alive. Later, when the ship was quiet, and Kale was walking the corridors on his way to set a course for Drava 6. Athon spoke one last time. The voice was soft and private, not directed at Kale, but at itself, the way a person talks to themselves, when they have realized something that has been true all along, but that they only now have the words for. 12,000 years I waited, Athon said, and 10,000 species I rejected, and the one who was worthy just wanted to fix things. A pause. The Vorai were right, Athon said, and they were always right. The throne of Athon turned toward the stars, and jumped to faster than light, and carried its engineer toward the next broken thing that needed mending. And the galaxy spun on behind them, alive and whole, and full of people who would tell this story for as long as stories were told. The story of the human who received the greatest ship ever built, and used it the way he used every tool he had ever held. Not to conquer, not to rule, but to fix what was broken, and to keep what was precious, and to hold on to the small, stubborn, ordinary things that made life worth the trouble of living it.